Every organism faces a core problem: surviving the immediate future. To do this, biological systems use an associative algorithm to map causal relationships and predict what happens next. This is classical conditioning. Before learning occurs, an unconditioned stimulus, like food, naturally triggers an unconditioned response, like salivation. A neutral conditioned stimulus, such as a bell, triggers nothing. During a phase called acquisition, the neutral cue and the unconditioned stimulus are repeatedly paired. The neutral cue gradually gains predictive value. After enough pairings, the organism learns the association. The bell alone now elicits a conditioned response. This response can spread. In generalization, similar tones will also trigger the behavior. In discrimination, the organism learns to respond strictly to the exact pitch of the original bell, ignoring close matches. By mapping these variables, the organism constructs a predictive model of its environment, turning a sequence of sounds into a high-fidelity map of the future. This raises a mechanistic question about what exactly the brain records during acquisition. One theory argues for a direct stimulus-to-response reflex. The bell directly causes the drool. The competing theory argues the bell links to a mental expectation of the food itself. To test this, researchers devalue the unconditioned stimulus after learning is complete. They pair the food with an agent that causes nausea, making the animal reject the food. When they ring the bell again, the conditioned response to the sound weakens. The animal does not blindly react to the sound. The cue is linked to the specific meaning of the outcome, demonstrating that learning is a cognitive expectation. For decades, theory held temporal proximity-linked events. But overlap isn't sufficient. Learning requires contingency. If food follows a tone 80% of the time, but also appears randomly without it, learning fails. The cue must predict the outcome better than chance. This rule governs how stimuli compete. In blocking, prior learning stops new associations. If cue A already predicts an outcome, adding cue B produces no learning. Similarly, if two cues appear together, the more salient one captures the associative strength, overshadowing the weaker one. Even repeated exposure to a cue on its own has consequences. Pre-exposing a bell without any outcome teaches the organism the sound is irrelevant, severely slowing down any future attempts to associate it with an event. This is known as latent inhibition. Environments change, requiring organisms to perform reversal learning. When contingencies flip, old associations must be actively inhibited so new ones can form. Stimuli do not exist in a vacuum. Cues constantly compete for attention, and an organism's prior knowledge actively dictates what it is capable of learning next. To quantify this, psychologists developed the Rescorla-Wagner model. It proposes learning is driven by prediction error, the lambda minus v total term. You only learn when surprised. This explains blocking perfectly. If the outcome is completely predicted, error drops to zero and no new learning occurs. However, Rescorla-Wagner fails completely at explaining latent inhibition. During pre-exposure to a cue with no outcome, the prediction error is technically zero, meaning the model says nothing changes. Yet behaviorally, we know learning slows down. The Macintosh model resolves this by focusing on attention. If a cue is a poor predictor, the organism's attention to it drops, explaining why pre-exposed cues are harder to learn later. Other frameworks, like the comparator hypothesis, argue blocking isn't a failure to learn at all. It claims the organism does learn the secondary cue, but at the testing phase, the stronger cue simply outcompetes it. No single equation captures the entire process. Mapping behavioral learning requires combining models of prediction error, attentional modulation, and competitive performance. This machinery regulates extreme physiological states. Opponent process theory states every significant stimulus triggers a primary reaction, like immense fear, followed by an opposing biological counterreaction. With repetition, the dynamic shifts. The primary A state shrinks, while the opposing B state strengthens to maintain homeostasis. In chronic drug use, the environment becomes the conditioned stimulus. The brain links the room or the needle to the impending chemical spike. These cues trigger the biological B state early, creating a conditioned compensatory response that offsets the drug's effects. This is the physiological basis of tolerance. If a user takes their standard dose in a completely new environment, the familiar predictive cues are missing. The compensatory response fails to trigger, and the body is subjected to the unmitigated force of the chemical, frequently resulting in a fatal overdose. These internal defenses transform environmental context into a matter of life and death, where the presence or absence of a familiar cue dictates whether the body can withstand its own chemistry. When an established predictive cue is repeatedly presented without its outcome, the conditioned response gradually fades, a process called extinction. Extinction is not forgetting. The original memory trace remains intact. Instead, the brain writes a new inhibitory layer over it, teaching the organism that the cue now predicts the absence of the outcome. 4 behavioral phenomena prove the original memory survives. The response can return if tested in a new context, known as renewal. It can reappear after a delay, known as spontaneous recovery. Reinstatement brings it back if the outcome is presented alone, and disinhibition triggers it if a novel distraction interrupts the extinction process. Extinguished behaviors, such as fear or addiction, are never truly gone. They simply lie dormant beneath a fragile, context-dependent overlay. To see how these associative networks are actually built, we have to look at the physical brain. The leading physiological model is Hebbian learning, where repeated firing strengthens the connection between neurons, a process known as long-term potentiation. At the molecular level, pairing the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli causes the neurotransmitter glutamate to bind with AMPA receptors. This depolarizes the receiving neuron's membrane. This electrical shift ejects a magnesium block from the neighboring NMDA receptors. Calcium ions rush in, triggering structural changes that permanently strengthen the synaptic connection. While synaptic strengthening provides a foundation, it faces a structural contradiction. Long-term potentiation is a slow, enduring physical change, yet conditioning can occur in a single trial, flip instantly during reversal learning, and vanish or reappear based purely on context. These rapid, fluid shifts suggest the biological logic of learning exists at a level of complexity that a single physical junction cannot satisfy. Synapses provide the necessary hardware, but capturing the full algorithm requires looking at the larger neural circuitry. Mapping the behavioral proofs of extinction reveals this wider circuit. In a conditioned fear response, the amygdala acts as the primary mediator, firing heavily to express the physiological reaction. During extinction, the infralimbic prefrontal cortex becomes highly active, sending inhibitory signals down to the amygdala and actively suppressing the fear response. The entire mechanism is routed through the hippocampus. It acts as a gatekeeper, processing spatial and contextual data to decide whether the prefrontal cortex should maintain its suppression. This is exactly why moving an organism to a new room causes the extinguished fear to renew. Finally, we find the mathematical prediction error from the Rescorla-Wagner model physically encoded in the brain's dopaminergic system, which precisely fires to represent the exact difference between expectation and reality. Biological systems have evolved a highly dynamic prediction engine, one that integrates mathematical error rates with neural circuitry to continuously map the causal structure of reality.